In our last video, you learned how to maximize your bankroll with contest selection and bankroll management principles. First, set a bankroll and play 2.5 to 5% of that bankroll per night. Second, stick to GPPs in your contest selection. Third, balance ROI and variance by mixing in single entry and 3 max contests with 20 max and 150 max contests. And finally, play a unique lineup into each entry you're entering and think about these lineups and contests as a portfolio. Now in this video, let's talk about how to build great lineups for these contests we've entered. There's a billion things you can do to be successful in DFS, but our goal is to teach the fundamentals. Most DFS players frankly try to do too much, and at best, they waste a bunch of time on things that maybe add a little bit of value, and at worst are probably spending a ton of time on things that actually hurt the quality of their lineups. Your goal should be to keep it simple, and that's really the point of this video. If you get this right, you'll be a long-term winner at DFS. To beat these MLB GPPs, you need upside, which means building lineups with players with high ceilings and the right stacks to get correlation, all while separating yourself and differentiating yourself from what the rest of the field is doing. The problem is that with other optimizers, you have to spend almost all of your time programming rules into the optimizer just to get them to do the basics. This prevents you from spending more valuable and frankly more enjoyable time on research. The worst part is after you spend all of this time here, you'll never actually account for all the exceptions and nuance. Should you always play a 5 stack on DraftKings, for example? Should your stacks ever have gaps in the batting order? What kinds of players can be used as one-offs that aren't correlated to the rest of the lineup at all? These questions never end, and the answers are different on every single slate. Sports are not played in spreadsheets. The reason why this is hard is because optimizers only understand individual players, not baseball games. In real life, players' performance affects one another. You know that playing both Aaron Judge and Justin Verlander in the same lineup together when they're facing off against each other is a recipe for disaster. Your projections don't show that, and your optimizer doesn't have a clue. Understanding these specific correlations is essential to beating these GPPs, but optimizers pretend they don't exist. Every slate, it becomes your job to teach the optimizer how sports are actually played. The difference with SaberSim is that we simulate games, and understanding this difference is crucial to building a successful process before you ever build your first lineup. We sim these baseball games thousands of times, play by play, updating those sims every time news breaks. So you're not using traditional average projections here. These are thousands of game scripts fed directly into our lineup optimizer. Our sims take into account pitcher rotations and bullpen management, park factors, weather, handedness, short-term and long-term player history, and dozens of other factors that average projections just can't. This means that you're getting thousands of high upside lineups from SaberSim in just a couple clicks. The lineups you get from SaberSim reflect the most profitable lineups you can play when the game scripts they are based on actually play out on the baseball diamond. Don't get me wrong, it still takes work to win, and I'll talk about what some of that work is here in just a moment, but SaberSim gives you a shortcut. It allows you to skip 80% of the chores you're probably used to and invest that time into things that actually matter. So here's how the actual process works in SaberSim. First, set your must-have rules. Then build a pool of high upside lineups. Then rank those lineups based on how they'll perform best in your contest. Then conduct your research and decide if you want to change anything or take a stand. Then diversify your lineups and finally enter them into your contests. When it comes to setting your must-have rules, you want to keep it simple here and really just put in your deal breakers. Eliminate lineup types that you would never want to play in your lineups. What I typically do is use the stack types tool here to just eliminate the stack types I know I don't want to see at all. I'll eliminate everything at first and then add in most of the larger stack types where I know I'm building very correlated lineups. For the average slate for baseball, I typically want everything from 5-3 to 4-2. For smaller slates 5 games or less, I'll typically also allow in here some different stack types here to allow myself a little bit of a different construction. But for a larger slate, like the 11-game opening day slate, I'm typically going to roll with stack types like this. SaberSim sims are already going to build you pretty highly correlated lineups anyway, but I know right off the bat here that I don't want to see a 3-3 stack in my contest, so I'm just going to eliminate that right away. The second step is to build a pool of high upside lineups. We'll click Build Lineups here and set our dropdowns equal to the contest that we're playing the largest number of lineups from our contest portfolio. In my case, this is the Mini Max, which is a 150 max contest with around 25,000 entrants in it. All I want to do here is make sure that my pool size is as large as allowed. For DFS standard subscribers, this will be 500 lineups. For SaberSim Pro subscribers, this will be 5,000. And then I'm going to go ahead and just start a new build. Now, this is where a lot of the magic happens. We're looking at our simulated game outcomes and building the highest ceiling lineups for different possible game scripts. We're building a large pool of these lineups because we're going to play a unique lineup into each of our entries that we've entered, and we want to build as many lineups as we can to identify the best ones and also to make it easier for us to diversify. Once our lineups are built, we need to rank them based on which ones will perform the best in our contests. And to think about this correctly, we need to start thinking about ownership. Now, to beat GPPs, it's not just enough to score an arbitrarily high number of points. We need to be scoring points that our opponents in those contests are not, which means lower owned fantasy points are more valuable than higher owned fantasy points. The problem here is that how much to account for ownership depends on the size of the slate and the contest we're playing here. And that's why we came up with SaberScore. These lineups by default are ranked by a SaberScore here, which values lineup upside, the raw scoring potential of a lineup, against the ownership of a lineup, balancing these two factors together. Our SaberScores will automatically keep track of how large the slate is and the contest you said you're building lineups here for, and pick the correct weighting of the ownership factors based on that. And personally, I don't do a lot here. I'm pretty happy at choosing the default SaberScore that makes sense for that slate and contest and adding my value in the next step. If you're on the SaberSim Pro plan, you do have the opportunity to create custom metrics and change the weighting of these factors, but we'll talk about that more in our next video here, and for now, just use the default SaberScore. Now that we've got our pool of high upside lineups and we've ranked them accordingly, it's time to conduct and apply our research and potentially take a stand. The biggest edges in DFS come from finding the spots that others are getting wrong and taking these stands. And while there is wisdom of a crowd on average, there's a fine line between an intelligent crowd and an angry mob. Determining what you're dealing with on this particular slate is the goal of your research. We'll cover how to do some of this research in just a second, but first I want to talk about who to research. You don't really have time to research every single player on a slate, and that's really fine because you don't need to. You can assume the crowd, which is represented by the SaberSim ownerships, is pretty close to right on most players. You can sort your lineups by leverage here to see where SaberSim disagrees, which is your player exposure minus the projected ownership. Unlike other optimizers, SaberSim actually has pretty smart insights and will take stands intelligently. This isn't to say that you should just blindly trust it all the time, but you can consider SaberSim an expert just like your favorite daily fantasy baseball YouTuber or podcaster or somebody that writes articles or presents data that you enjoy and think is pretty sharp. You want to focus your research on the biggest plus leverage and minus leverage outliers because these are the biggest stands that SaberSim is telling you to take by default. This is really where your research comes in. The goal should be to get second and third and even fourth opinions from other experts to help you make up your own mind on these leverage spots. And what if you can't make up your own mind? Well, the simplest play and the safest play is going to be to just match your exposures or get your exposures closer to what the field is doing. Having better correlation in terms of your stacks and one-offs will still give you an edge in your contests, but you're leaving a little bit of money on the table by not digging a little deeper and determining where the best stands are to take. You can also put your trust in SaberSim completely and not make any changes, just take all the stands that SaberSim is telling you. And to be honest, this is probably a little bit closer to what I'm actually doing on most slates, but while I'm trusting SaberSim to figure things out better than the field will do, no model is going to be perfect, and getting second and third opinions can be really valuable. The more experts agree that this is the right stand to take, the more confident you can be. When it comes to actually applying your research and making these adjustments here, you'll want to use the minimum and maximum exposure columns. Set a maximum exposure cap on any player that you want to reduce your positive leverage to that player and get closer to the field, and set a minimum exposure floor to any player that you want to reduce your negative leverage to and get a little bit closer to the field that way. Overall, these adjustments are a little bit more of an art than a science, but our rule of thumb here that we like to use is to avoid being more than 2x the field on any player projected over about 5% ownership. Once you get to very low projected projected owned players, this rule can break down a little bit, but capping your exposure to Garrett Cole, for example, at something like 50% is going to reduce the magnitude of the stand we're taking there while still getting us over the field on his exposure overall. Now, I'm going to actually go ahead and do a little bit of research into this slate here and come back with some ideas of what I want to adjust, looking at the positive and negative leverage here, and walk through some of my adjustments. Okay, so I've done a little bit of research into this slate here. Let's talk about some of the changes that I made. First of all, on the pitchers first. It's opening day here, and a lot of these teams are rolling out their top ace, and I think that a lot of these overall pitchers here are actually pretty close to one another. Based on the ownership projections, you can see that the fields think so too, and we were getting quite a bit of an exposure to Garrett Cole and Corbin Burnes right off the bat. I don't want to get rid of that stand completely. If SaberSim thinks that those are the top two plays on the slate, I want to get some exposure there, but I don't think I needed the 65 or 70% exposure I was getting to Garrett Cole and Corbin Burnes when Shane McClanahan, Aaron Nola, Max Scherzer, and all these other aces are on the slate. I capped my maximum exposure to those two guys to bring some of my other exposure to some of these other top pitchers up in my pool. There were actually two pitchers that I took a stand on in the negative direction here as well. The first one was Jacob deGrom, who I was getting a little bit of exposure to automatically here, but we were already well under the field on deGrom, and he's dealt with some injury issues in spring training. I'm going to make this one of my biggest stands on the field here and actually just uncheck him completely from my pool. Another guy I was looking into was Alex Manoah here for the Blue Jays. Alek Manoah. He's had some injury issues or believes to be dealing with a little bit of an injury in training camp. The velocity on his fastball has been down about 3 miles an hour all training camp here. I'm going to go ahead and fade him as well. We were getting some exposure, and by default with SaberSim, we were about equal to the field, but I think it's possible that SaberSim here is not actually taking into account that potential injury, so I'm going to uncheck him as well. When it comes to my hitters, there were a couple things I was looking into. First, I was getting a lot of positive leverage to the Brewers bats here, and it seems like they're in a pretty good spot. It doesn't seem like the field was really interested in playing a lot of them, so there are going to be a little bit of a low-owned stack. They're projected pretty well and have a decent Vegas total, but I didn't feel like they needed to be far and away my highest leverage bats on the field. There was a big gap in between all of the Brewers bats and some of these other stacks here, so I capped some of the exposure to some of the more highly exposed bats here, like Contreras and Jesse Winker here, just to bring my exposure down and reduce the size of that stand a little bit. One of the other things I like to do in baseball is double down on some of my negative stands here. So in this case, since I'm already deciding I wanted to fade Alek Manoah and Jacob deGrom, I'm going to get a little exposure to the teams that they're playing against here. In this case, the Phillies and the Cardinals. Both teams with really strong bats and teams that I think can really go off if those two pitchers that I'm already fading fail. So in this case, what I like to do here is just get an idea of what is the field rostering these players at. And some of these ownership projections haven't updated yet. But in this case, the ownership for the Phillies here is like 2 or 3%. And the ownership for the Cardinals is like 3 to 5% here. So what I actually did is I went ahead to the team stack section and just set a minimum exposure to those two stacks. I got 10% minimum exposure to the Phillies and the Cardinals, and I'll let SaberSim figure out exactly what bats for those stacks make the most sense, but I want to get a little exposure to those teams since I'm already fading the pitchers on the other side. And remember, this is the part of the process where you should be spending the bulk of your time. Or put another way, this is the part of the process that SaberSim allows you to spend more time on because of all the stuff that we're automating behind the scenes with the way that your lineups are actually constructed based on those game scripts. So study your leverage column, figure out where you're taking some of the biggest stands by default, and do a little bit of additional research to see if you want to take those stands, if you want to reduce the size of them a bit, or if you want to take some completely different stands that you found based on your own independent research. Once we're happy with the direction of our lineups, it's time to diversify our portfolio. And diversification in DFS is almost a bit of a free lunch. When you're diversifying, you're investing a little bit less into the best plays, but with the variance in baseball, you're not giving up that much by having a little bit less exposure there, and you're gaining quite a bit more in terms of reducing the variance of your lineup portfolio. However, the further you push this, the more you start giving up in terms of overall lineup quality, and the less you're getting back in terms of diversification, so we want to strike the right balance here. The goal of diversification is to make the lineups that you are playing different from one another, and the best way to do that is to use min-uniques players. What I like to do here is to figure out what is the maximum number of min unique players I can use in my lineup set, and then to set min uniques at one less than that number. So to identify that maximum value, we'll just uptick this here and see how high can I take my min uniques while I'm still getting the 132 unique players I need to fill my entries. One thing to note here is earlier in the video, I did have this set at 150, and I realized after that I'm only playing 132 unique lineups into this slate, so I reduced that number of lineups here. But anyway, we can see that we're still getting 132 lineups back at min uniques equal to 3, so we'll continue to increase this here, and we're still getting it at 4 and 5. And at 6 min unique players for each lineup, our number of lineups reduces to 105. We're no longer able to reach that number of lineups we need with 6 min uniques. So the maximum value in this case is 5. So what I'm going to do is set this equal to 4. And this should just go to show you that the overall amount of lineups that you can make that are high quality is pretty diverse. And that goes back to what I was saying before about this being a bit of a free lunch here. It's generally easier than people think to play a more diverse set of lineups, and you sacrifice very little in terms of lineup EV or lineup quality to do so. At this point, we've built our pool of high upside lineups. We've ranked them according to the contest we're playing here. We've done our research and applied some changes there based on our research, and we've diversified our pool, so we're ready to get these lineups into our contests. I'll go ahead and click Fill Entries here just to load these lineups into the entry file we uploaded earlier. And I like to use the unique random fill method to fill these lineups into my contests. It's going to take a random lineup from my set and fill it into each entry here. And the reason why I like unique random is because it means the ownership or the exposure I'm getting to any given player here becomes the probability that that player shows up in any one of my lineups. If I have 10% exposure to some of these stacks that I set before here, I want there to be about a 10% chance that a lineup with a Philly stack shows up in any contest, and that's what unique random is going to do. I'll click Fill All Entries here and then download and open DraftKings, downloading my uploaded entries file here so I can just upload it to the site. Once I'm uploaded, I'm all set and I'm ready for lock. But that's not the end of the process. The next step here is being prepared for news breaking after lock and late swapping accordingly. So let's go ahead and dive into that. A lot of people late swap like the only purpose of the tool is to avoid zeros in your lineup. And while that's an important part of it here, that's really only part of the puzzle. We should be late swapping our lineups to take advantage of the more accurate information we have as the slate goes along, whether that's new starting lineups, injury reports, or so on. With that said, overall, late swapping in baseball is less important than in a sport like NBA. Scratches and late breaking news is going to be less common, and it's less likely to totally flip the slate on its head when it does happen. But we can't ignore it completely, and there's still an easy edge to be gained here in your baseball lineups. When I'm entering my lineups at lock, there's two things that I'm looking closely at here as it pertains to the late swap for that day. The first is the overall schedule of the games that day. If this slate is locking at 11:05 local time for me here, I'm going to make sure that I want to be prepared and ready to swap around noon, just before noon here, around 1 o'clock, and then again around 2 o'clock here, because there's different game windows locking all at those times. Another thing I typically like to look at is my entries file here in the entries tab to see what questionable players I have and what teams they play for. I'll want to make sure I'm paying special attention to the Padres lineup and to the Tampa Bay and Colorado lineups and any other players here that I'm seeing I have exposure to that are listed as questionable or day-to-day. When those starting lineups come out for those teams, I definitely want to make sure that Soto, Wander Franco, Jurickson Profar, and any other questionable players I have are in the starting lineups, so I'm not getting a zero there and I'm adjusting accordingly. When it comes time to actually late swap here, you'll want to check back in about 10 or 15 minutes before the next round of games starts and check to see if the team abbreviations here have a green check mark next to them. Once they do, it means we've gotten the confirmed starting lineup for that team and we've ran updated sims on our end to account for that starting lineup. If the teams have a green check mark, you'll next want to check for the red lightning bolt indicator here. If this is indeed turned red, it means that you have players that are now since been ruled out in your entries file, and it absolutely means you need to late swap. First thing we want to do is just get those players that are out of our lineup so we don't end up with a zero. So we'll click this here, and we can see in this hypothetical, Profar, Soto, and Franco all get ruled out. If you have hitters that have been ruled out of your lineup, I typically prefer to immediately swap these to the best available player from the same team. We'll go ahead and click apply. And what this is going to do is make sure that is in as many lineups as possible, those players are getting swapped to the best player from the same team, maintaining the stacks and correlations that the original lineup had. A few players in this case could not be swapped to another player from the same team, so I'll do another swap to just swap them to the best available player here, and now I know that I have no out players in these lineups. I'll download and open DraftKings here, getting a fresh entries file that removes all of the out players from my lineups and re-upload that to DraftKings. Once we've actually done that quick swap to get out players out of our lineups, we want to run a late swap build here to rebuild our lineups that are already entered around the players who have already locked to make sure we're playing the best possible lineups with the updated news we have now. Removing Juan Soto from our Padres stacks is great if he ends up not playing, but we also might want a little bit less Padres stacks overall because such a big bat has been removed from the lineups, so late swapping will allow us to take that into account. To run a late swap here, all we'll do is start a new build. During a slate, this will automatically default to a late swap build here, but for this example here, I'll just turn late swap on with the toggle, and I want to just rebuild all of my lineups here. I'm going to go ahead and late swap all 132 of my lineups, which is taking into account the new sims that would in theory reflect Soto, Franco, and Profar in this case getting ruled out, and rebuilding the best new possible lineups without those players. In the late swap build, you'll want to take the same steps we did before lock. Make sure you're ranking your lineups by the correct Saber score, take or adjust any of the stands that you're getting here by default, and diversify your lineups with the min unique player option. Keep in mind that some of your research may not apply in the same way if big news has broken throughout the slate. A team that you really wanted to stack before, like the Padres in this case, might not be as good of a stack, so it is a good idea to revisit any changes you're seeing in your exposures here and rethink how you've overall researched and attacked the slate. Once we're ready, we can go ahead and just download and open DraftKings again, getting a fresh entries file and re-uploading this to DraftKings with lineups that take into account the most recent news. Now, like I said before, late swap in MLB is less of a factor than in a sport like NBA because these surprise scratches happen less often and they affect the optimal strategy for the slate less than they do in a sport like NBA. If you come back to check in for the next game window of games locking here and see that the games have confirmed starting lineups and the red lightning bolt indicator is not lit up, you probably don't have to swap for that window of games. It is unlikely that there would be news that broke where a player got ruled out that impacted the slate enough to late swap where you didn't have any exposure to that player if you're following our contest selection principles and getting a lot of unique lineups in play and our diversification principles, making sure that those lineups are diverse. In other words, and in simpler words here, if the lightning bolt indicator here is not in red and the games locking next are already confirmed with starting lineups, you probably don't need to run a late swap build. With that said, there is almost no downside to late swapping apart from the time it takes to redo that part of your process. If you're ever unsure if you should be late swapping, just do it. Worst case scenario, you're accounting for a little bit of additional information you didn't have at lock and rebuilding your lineups accordingly. At this point in the process, you know how to select the best contests to play, how to build great winning lineups to enter into those contests, and how to late swap to react to late breaking news. The most important thing at this point is to just get this process down. Focus on these fundamentals, keep your process simple, and make sure you've mastered these steps. And honestly, this is going to be all it takes to become a winning long-term DFS player. However, for players that are ready to continue to level up and take the next step, we've got more content ready for you, and we'll dive into how to do that in the next video.